Hi everyone, this is Zeus again for week 4 of our exploration into emotions and motivation. Over the last couple of weeks, we've tried to make some interesting distinctions between what I've called now instincts, that's sort of automatic emotions you have absolutely no control over, that seem to be involved in our evolution and seem to have a trigger that's almost innate to us, a genetic trigger, and emotional impulse, which is something we don't really think about, but at the time and we just react, but maybe with some kind of training and awareness we could have some intervention. Then just plain emotions, which is the event or episode of having a certain kind of what I call affect. And then feeling itself, which begins to get broader and a little bit more vague. And then finally mood. So let's go ahead and go right to that and make these distinctions. We've had some great questions about this and some confusion over this. So the best way to do it is to just look at these terms again and really develop sound understandings and definitions around them. So I'm going to be sending out this paper. Basically, the way I describe all these 5 things, instinct, emotional impulse, emotion, feeling, and mood, as degrees of affect. Affect is the general term that I use, I'm referring to here, as the whole complex of different levels of instinct, emotional impulse, emotion, feeling, and mood, anything that might be considered a more heart or hormonally based, body-based way of responding to stimuli versus thought, intellectual, or head-based. That's a very sort of cloudy definition, but I think you can kind of get the idea. We'll start with the densest and simplest forms of affect, those that have a very clear object and a very clear causal mechanism, and work our way to the more diffuse and complex, those things that don't have a very clear object. Usually, when you have an instinct, it's instantaneous, it's automatic. We're talking about feelings and mood as we move more to the more what I call inchoate or vague senses of affect. All of a sudden, we're not exactly sure what we're feeling bad about or good about. So here are the definitions that I put up. Instinct. Instinct is basically an unconscious, unaware, involuntary, or unchosen genetically programmed response that can result more or less automatically in an affective response. Again, affective is any of those broad complex feelings, and these are all different parts of affect or affective response. Researchers have been able to detect certain universal receptors in the human brain, for instance, that cause a person to jump and experience a moment of surprise, panic, or fear when seeing something unexpectedly in the shape of a snake, like a garden hose, for instance. This is largely automatic, unconscious, reflexive, and completely out of one's control. It is the kind of universal affective response that makes most sense of the evolutionary psychology models and the natural, quote unquote, or entity understanding of emotion, as something within us that drives us to certain behaviors. And Ekman talks about this in terms of auto-appraiser. Our brain just jumps to an appraisal of the situation. There's no cognitive, basically, interference with that. We have an almost automatic and direct response. Now, what I've called an emotional impulse, and this is my term, is a largely unconscious, unaware, but voluntary, that is able to be influenced by choice. Now, maybe not in the moment, but if we become aware of our emotions, and we were talking about that this week, chapter 4, about how we can intervene or change what we become emotional about. But in this case, right when the emotional impulse happens, we don't have much of a choice. But it is eventually able to be influenced by choice. So it's a voluntary affective response stemming from environmental conditioning. A visceral triggered hatred of people from a different race and an accompanying behavior where racist profanities just pop out of the mouth would be an apt example of an emotional impulse. It's not genetically determined, but highly influenced by socio-cultural upbringing and reinforcement. Emotional impulse can sometimes be transformed through social training and experience that meets with the individual personality as reformed racists are proof. In other words, if this was more like an instinct, there would not be a whole lot of way to reform this. A person may be brought up in a racist culture, become aware over time that it doesn't work for a lot of other reasons, maybe even social pressure from the outside, and then finally says, listen, I'm not going to do this, this is wrong, and literally begins to change. Now, this doesn't mean that you won't have those little impulses and jumps. I've even had it too. I worked in anti-racist workshops. I've taught multicultural education, but I saw people from a different race coming through a neighborhood with, that was of a different race, and there was a part of my mind that made me laugh too. That still leaped up into that, to that category. It didn't go to the level of appraising or judging those people, but I noticed it was an impulse. It was almost an instinctual response. And I think that was still some deep-seated social programming back there that was still trying to work its way through my system, even though as a person, as an anti-racist, an avid anti-racist, and a person working to include people and actively working for social justice, I'm obviously not of that mind. So let's go on to emotion. Did I finish that up? Yeah, emotional impulse, let's go ahead and go here, can sometimes be transformed through social training and experience that meets with the individual personality, as reformed racists have proved. This concept coheres with the psychological models of emotion, emphasizing social context, construction, and relationship as constituting affect. So again, if you notice, you can't just take one model and use it for everything. A lot of times these different models that you're seeing in your research papers will work for certain arenas and certain events and certain effects, but they simply won't work for others. Now let's go on to emotion. Emotion is a more conscious, aware, and voluntary, able to be influenced by choice, affective response felt on the individual level. I like to call emotions crystallized feeling. Crystallized is what I mean by coate. It is shoo. We can put our hands around it. We can kind of identify the object, and we can be aware that we are having emotions, and we can choose to change emotional patterns by learning a new way to interact with the object of our emotions. This does not mean that we can simply choose our emotions themselves at a given moment. And this was brought up by one of the students, and she was disagreeing because she thought I was saying that was what you do. I was saying, no, you can choose how to interact, and you can choose how to respond and become aware. But if you're in the midst of it, probably not. But we can choose to become aware of emotions, appraise them as desirable or undesirable, and train our understanding and responses in such a way that affects the experience and expression of a particular emotion, giving a particular stimulus or trigger. This concept goes well with constructivist models of emotion that emphasize individual variability, personal experience, and learning. Again, you can have very different people responding very different ways to the exact same stimulus because it's context, oftentimes background history, that influences our way of interacting with and interpreting emotions. So, feeling. Okay, now feeling. What's the difference in emotion and a feeling? Feeling is an affective response that involves a conscious but more vague sense of things. Intuition is a form of feeling. You may get, I like this example. I was actually kind of proud of coming up with this. You may get a conscious creepy sense from a person, perhaps because you're picking up on subconscious subtle signs. So you might actually have signs that are not conscious, but your conscious mind registers them. You may find yourself avoiding that person, but you are unlikely to experience the outright crystallized emotion of disgust unless that person does something to confirm that creepiness. So you see what the difference is? The emotion is kind of crystallized feeling, oftentimes attached to a phenomenon or some kind of evidence. Whereas the feeling itself is kind of like a more vague sense that something might be up. It's almost like a precautionary or pre-feeling out kind of feeling. So we tend to act or not act upon feeling depending upon how ready we are to accept the consequences of confirming our feelings. Now, a good example of this, many times people will not act on a feeling that their partners are being unfaithful because they want to avoid the emotional pain that may come with concretely confirming that feeling. So again, there's something can oftentimes stop what happens between feeling and the crystallization into emotion, because emotion tends to generate a lot of energy. It also comes with consequences and knowledge you can't really take back. And again, part of what I hope we do in this class is to become better about accepting our intuition and better about accepting truth in terms of emotions, in terms of as ways to sense what's going on around us, rather than getting the environment to conform to us. And we'll talk about that in Ekman. He talked about us trying to confirm our emotions with evidence rather than the other way around, intervening with our emotions and becoming more able to go into them and see whether or not they are a really legitimate manifestation or sign of what's going on. So note, I'm not talking here of some of the ways in which feelings are used commonly as a synonym for emotions, as in, I have feelings for you. You're not having intuitions for someone else. You're having intuitions about someone else. So feelings tend to be for, much more direct, much more relational, and feelings tend to be around or about. They suffuse the situation. So those are the two ways you can kind of, again, gain a distinction between the two. And finally, mood. Mood is a less conscious and even more vague, that is more inchoate, than feeling. I would define mood as an affective undercurrent or a feeling disposition. So it even comes before feeling. It's mood. I would define mood as which predisposes a person to act with a particular set of feelings or emotions. Think about it. When you're in a bad mood, you tend to select evidence from your surrounding stimuli that reinforces the bad mood. That is, give that bad mood what it wants. Elevator music becomes irritating rather than innocuous. Similarly, with good moods, you tend to select out and appraise or interpret stimuli according to a sunnier scale. In fact, research now shows that it is not communication nor avoidance of conflict that produces happier marriage, but the generous, accepting, or skeptical belittling interpretation of the spouse's behavior that becomes the major predictor of whether a couple will divorce. To use one of our classmates' examples, if your spouse asks you, "Did you do the dishes?" would you interpret that as an attack? He or she thinks I'm lazy because I didn't do them? Or as simply a request for information? Okay, let's do them now. While we have some time, the kids are playing. Again, those are the examples. Same question, two different reactions. A more generous intent, not taking it personally, and the other one's thinking that it's an attack. And a lot of that, again, is influenced by social context and background. So played out over time, moods can be very enduring and create dispositions that more volatilely erupt into conflict or conversely ease into cooperation. Why does any of this matter? Let's take some examples provided by the students in the class and from me. One of the students in the class challenged me on what she thought I was saying about emotions as being chosen or voluntary. Again, I referred to that before. I used her feedback to make the distinction between choosing an emotion in the moment and choosing how to respond or retrain emotional responses. Emotions are generally not chosen in the moment, but the emotional response patterns, and therefore individual future emotions, can be altered by effective interventions and training. So it was just a difference in understanding or orientation to this question. Now, oftentimes, and probably you have experienced this yourself, if you challenge a professor, flat on, you're taking a bit of a risk, and it does require a little bit of courage. So, in my case, I was able to detect her challenge as a good thing, and the rest of her essay as well done. So she got the full points. But had I had a background where I felt like anyone asking a question or challenging me was a form of criticism or a put down, I might have had a very different response, obviously. So if I had reacted as some teachers do in a defensive affective response and belittled or punished the student for challenging me, a very different emotional response and pattern would be established and future learning possibilities would be constricted. Again, this is just another example of how much I am committed to you expressing yourselves. When you risk in this class, I do admire it. I do, it's one of the things that I have talked about in terms of critical analysis, challenging the readings, academic readings, challenging me, right? And again, when it goes to the subject matter, it's not an insult. It really is kind of a way of honoring this class and me, that you would want to engage in a deeper way with the material. So that's my framework, coming to the material. So let's go to number 2. Punishment, trauma, fatigue, and threat in general cause emotional harm or lowering of energy that results in greater exhaustion of emotional resources. Emotional healing, that's shown that to happen in visualization, breathing, meditation, mindfulness, and even yoga, go the opposite direction. I received several responses to the article on dieting from week 1. One student linked the article up with her own struggles, his or her own struggles with food, showing her creative application of material, which I really look for in this class. The theme of the article was this: regulating your eating unsuccessfully has more to do with the emotional exhaustion than with lack of willpower. In other words, you're not too weak to resist. You're too tired to resist and make other choices that change eating patterns. You can see now how all this might affect motivation and self-esteem as well, two other themes that we're going to get to in this series. So you see this dynamic all the time with people who yo-yo diet. Will diet for a time and then get tired and then binge and then feel bad about themselves and try again to eat in moderation. Changing emotional patterns takes significant energy over time. And this is important because this student in class seemed to be beating him or herself up for a lack of willpower, thus adding to emotional fatigue and exacerbating the root of the problem. So how do we apply this if we're experiencing these same sorts of things? I know one diet and exercise program that encourages you to simply eat what you want on Sunday, perhaps to ease this willpower pressure. That's it. Find a day, a special day, constricted time and effort to say, I can eat what I want today. The other time I'm going to allow my sort of willpower to preside to a certain extent, and then I'm going to allow myself to rest on the Sabbath, if you will. and I'm not going to have to keep it up. I'm going to allow for a certain kind of grace to enter the situation and give myself a break. So positive addiction may be another way to apply this research insight. It's substituting out poor health or emotional habits in a way that increases energy and restores emotional resources. For me, this might simply be treating myself to a long walk rather than trying to beat myself into running. I don't try to overwhelm myself, and I look to the long term in my health. For some of you, it might mean concentrating on the weekly assignments and turning something that is good but not perfect if you have a busy schedule, and I do recommend that. Don't let guilt drive you into overextending yourself. Try to be well thought. Communicate with me if you have something really big coming up that's going to intervene. And if it turns out, good is going to have to be good enough today because you have so many other things on your plate, go to the summaries and the readings, go right to the questions, answer them in a very succinct way, get it off your plate, and you should be fine. You might miss a point or two, but for the most part, you'll be fine. And I think that's really important. You make choices. I certainly don't judge you. I want you to make this work for you. I want you to be able to demonstrate to me your capability, your critical ability, your creative ability, and like I said, your compassionate ability. So one of the ways I can be compassionate to you is to simply allow you the option of turning in something good, not great, on a particular week that you may be stressed. So there's another, again, this really helps bring into clear resolution these notions of impulse, emotional impulse, instinct, emotional impulse, emotions, feeling, and mood. Here, another student brought up the imagined example of variability of individual responses to the same stimulus. When learning to play the violin, she might associate the inevitable squeaks with steps toward learning to play more beautifully. Her mom might be annoyed, but tolerant, we're up here, knowing that it is leading to something worthwhile. There are all kinds of responses, and I'm going to do some that reflect. Her mom could be surprised by the squeak, right? Think it was a mouse, and jump up on a chair, indicating an instinctive response. Her mom could respond with an emotional impulse by scrubbing the sink extra hard because a violin playing reminded her of the opportunities she missed growing up. Her mom could be overcome by emotions of love and nostalgia and start crying, knowing that her little girl is growing up. Her mom could develop a feeling that this particular squeak on the violin was different than the others and indicates her daughter is improving. And finally, her mother might be in a bad mood from a day of work and react by yelling up at her daughter, "Close that door so I can't hear all that awful squeaking," or in a good mood and yell up, "It's really nice to hear you practicing, honey." So you get the idea. I mean, these are pretty good delineations between these things. And if you notice, they go from very clear, very direct, very quick to much, they last longer. They don't have as clear an object. They're not as coate or as crystallized as you go from instinct to mood. So I see it more as a matter of degree than a matter of kind. Obviously, they have different effects because when you don't have an object or when something lasts longer, it has different effects. But for the most part, they're just attributes along a scale. And think of these as a scale. Finally, note, as you see, all these responses at interplay are also influenced by the mom's socio-cultural variables. And I'm going to have you actually investigate this later on when we do our final paper on motivation. Conditioning by your gender, family past, generational considerations, etc., and underlying needs and concerns. need to be a good mom, concern for her daughter's well-being, and alternatively, a need for peace of mind and concern for her own self-image. So again, there are many things in this complex. We will be working with these aspects into our analysis in the group project and final paper. And finally, in notes, the main takeaway from this document involves challenging and stretching the conventional wisdom on choice, being voluntary, awareness, consciousness, and responsibility around emotions. As you can see from these examples, much of what we consider to be chosen or willful in terms of emotions turns out to be something different. And that which we do not consider open to choice can turn out to be influenced by learning and choice around emotions. To take just one example, to take a gender example, often boys' emotional immaturity and behavior right here is excused as boys will be boys, whereas girls are taught to take on more responsibility, even over things that should be the responsibility of others. I.e., she should not have tempted him with her sexy clothes. And you notice they try to use an evolutionary or instinctive response on the part of boys to put the responsibility on the girls. Like they can't help themselves. This will show you why it's important to make distinctions between something like instinct, emotional impulse, and emotion. Instinct really can't be changed. Emotional impulse can, it might be a lot harder, and emotions definitely. So these are not small things, learning these distinctions. And finally, these kinds of cultural constructs create social memes about what is acceptable and who is responsible in emotional expression. Often this is talked about as if it were natural state for males and females. I want you all to challenge this natural assumption and dig deeper into what can and cannot be changed in your understanding and intervention with emotions, because it has a direct bearing on the people we can be and the society we can have. So that's the real punchline there. Let's see. Let's not just simply accept, but let's see where we can go with this. Until next time, this is AskDrZeus signing off.